In November 1841, a group of gentlemen gathered for a meeting of the Numismatic Society of London. The subject of the day was a small, curious gold coin, recently procured in Rome. As the details were read out, a profound historical puzzle began to take shape. The coin bore the name of a famous Anglo-Saxon king, Offa of Mercia, who ruled in the 8th century. But surrounding his simple Latin title, Offa Rex, was a script that was utterly alien to the world of Christian England. It was elegant, angular Arabic, and its message was unmistakable. It was the Shahada, the Muslim profession of faith, and no one could figure out why it was on a Christian king's coin. Offa, who reigned from 757 to 796, was arguably the most powerful Anglo-Saxon ruler before Alfred the Great. He was a dominant force who could deal with the Frankish king Charlemagne on near equal footing. Their correspondence represents the oldest surviving diplomatic documents in English history. Offa was a king of immense ambition, demonstrated by grand projects like Offa's earthwork, a massive structure that still marks the border between England and Wales. He was also a savvy political operator who engaged directly and often contentiously with the Church. He even persuaded Pope Adrian I to grant him his own archbishopric at Lichfield, a move that centralized ecclesiastical power within his kingdom and away from Canterbury. This wouldn't be a lasting arrangement, and the archbishopric would be dissolved shortly after Offa's passing, but it showed his intense vision and ambition. Crucially for this mystery of the coin, Offa was a monetary visionary. His reign saw the most significant currency reform in Anglo-Saxon history, and he phased out the old currency and brought in a thin silver penny. This monetary reform was so successful that his successors would adopt variants which would remain in usage until after the Norman conquest. The new pennies were of exceptional artistic quality, often bearing elegant and surprisingly lifelike portraits of the king, far surpassing even contemporary Frankish coinage. For Offa, coinage was propaganda, a medium for projecting power and prestige. Seen in this light, the decision to mint a gold coin for international purposes was a logical next step for a ruler who had already mastered the use of currency as a tool of statecraft. The gold dinar itself is a masterpiece of flawed imitation. It's a direct and meticulous copy of a coin issued by the second Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mansur, in Baghdad. Its weight, at around 4 grams, closely matches the Abbasid standard, meaning it would have been accepted by weight in any market where the original was known. But for all this careful mimicry, the coin's Mercian origins are betrayed by a series of telltale errors. The most glaring is that the Latin inscription Offa Rex is stamped upside down in relation to the Arabic script that surrounds it. This is a telltale sign that the individual who designed the coin didn't actually understand what the script which was being copied meant. This mistake proves that the individual was simply copying a design from a coin which he didn't understand, treating the text on it as mere decoration rather than a declaration of faith. These errors effectively demolish the most sensational theory about the coin, that Offa had secretly converted to Islam and issued the coin to indicate this. Since there's absolutely no indication that Offa knew anything about Islam, one of the most popular theories about what happened is actually quite ironic. Historical sources, including a letter from Pope Leo III, confirmed that Offa had promised to send an annual payment of 365 gold pieces, called mancus, to Rome. The fact that the only known example of the coin was discovered in Rome lends this theory powerful circumstantial weight. The key is the word mancus. In Anglo-Saxon England, a mancus was a unit of account worth 30 silver pennies, but the term itself is now widely believed to derive from the Arabic word mankush. This was specifically used to refer to Islamic gold dinars used throughout the Muslim world and where Islamic traders flourished. So, when Offa promised the Pope 365 mancuses, he may have very literally meant 365 dinar-style gold coins. This is where the supreme irony comes in. A Christian king, sending to his head of faith gold coins, which he mistakenly stamped with the Muslim declaration of faith. While this would be the most amusing explanation to resolve this mystery, there's actually another one which is more widely accepted. In the 8th century, the Abbasid gold dinar was the dominant high-value currency of the Mediterranean world, and the medieval equivalent of the US dollar in the region. Its weight and purity were trusted from Islamic Spain to the Levant, and anywhere in between. For English merchants, diplomats, or pilgrims traveling south, carrying a coin that looked, felt, and weighed the same as a dinar would have been a huge advantage. This was essentially their way of ensuring their coinage would be readily accepted in foreign markets. Gold was scarce in England, and by minting his own version of the most stable and prestigious currency available, Offa was piggybacking on the economic might of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was also a brilliant act of propaganda, which fits Offa to the T. By placing his name on a dinar, Offa was associating himself with the economic power of the caliphs. Ultimately, the two leading theories aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they likely represent two sides of a single sophisticated strategy. Offa had a specific obligation to send 365 gold dinars to Rome each year. He chose to copy the Abbasid dinar because it was the most trusted and recognized gold coin standard in the world. In doing so, he created a coin that could both fulfill his papal tribute and serve as a viable international currency for his subjects. The Offa Rex stamp ensured the Pope knew who the generous donation came from, while also advertising his power and sophistication along the trade routes the coin would travel. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just taking a second to remind you to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also, don't forget to hype up this video so it gets out to more people and I can keep producing the content you enjoy. In the early summer of 1190, the fate of the Holy Land seemed to hang in the balance. The Third Crusade, a massive Christian response to Saladin's capture of Jerusalem, was underway. While the kings of France and England prepared their sea voyages, the most formidable force was already on the march. At its head was the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, known as Barbarossa. At nearly 70 years old, he was a living legend, a veteran of the Second Crusade, and the ruler of a vast European empire for almost 4 decades. This wasn't the crumbling ancient Holy Roman Empire of the early modern period, but rather the leading state in Europe of the time. Barbarossa commanded what was perhaps the largest crusader army ever assembled, and his campaign was a juggernaut. After navigating the Balkans, his army of up to 20,000 men, including thousands of elite heavy knights, had smashed through Seljuk Turkish resistance in Anatolia. He won a massive victory at the Battle of Iconium in 1190, and the Crusaders took substantial loot and were granted passage through to the Holy Land. Importantly for this medieval historical mystery, they also took a number of high noblemen hostage to ensure their own safety. The news was so alarming that Saladin himself abandoned the siege of Acre to prepare for the emperor's seemingly inevitable arrival. This crusade was to be the crowning achievement of Barbarossa's long and storied reign. Instead, on June 10, 1190, in the cool waters of a small river in modern-day Turkey, it all came to a sudden, bizarre, and catastrophic end. The story of how Frederick Barbarossa died is a puzzle of conflicting medieval accounts, each colored by the author's perspective and purpose. The most immediate and likely most accurate version comes from an anonymous eyewitness, a cleric traveling with the army. He penned what has become known as the letter on the death of the Emperor Frederick within days of the event, and his account is shockingly mundane. After successfully crossing a river and having lunch, the old lion, exhausted from the day's march, decided to bathe and swim to cool off from the oppressive heat. In that moment of simple leisure, he drowned in what the author calls an unexpected accident. This version presents a tragic, anticlimactic end for a great warrior. However, this simple story of an accident was, for many, an unfitting end. In a medieval world where a sudden death without final confession was seen as a bad death, implying God's disapproval, such an end was a theological crisis. Consequently, other narratives soon emerged that sought to reframe the event in a more heroic light. The Saxon Chronicle, for example, tells a more dramatic tale. In this version, the emperor, impatient with a bridge congested with his own soldiers, decided to charge across the river on his horse. Weighed down by heavy armor and caught in a swift current, he was swept away and drowned. This account transforms his death from a moment of vulnerability into an act of a warrior's impetuous will. Under this account, he was simply so full of zeal that he couldn't wait to bring the fight to the enemy. A third perspective comes from the Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, who recorded that Barbarossa was drowned in waist-deep water through an act of divine intervention. Notably, numerous noble hostages from the Islamic world had been taken by Barbarossa's forces to ensure their safe passage to the Holy Land. It's believed that this chronicler may have derived his account from one of these individuals who witnessed what happened, or at least directly heard about it. Modern historical consensus overwhelmingly sides with the earliest, most direct source, the eyewitness account of the emperor going for a swim. The debate today isn't about whether he drowned, but about the precise medical cause behind the accident. When viewed through a biomedical lens, the story becomes chillingly clear. Barbarossa was an elderly man who was severely fatigued and overheated after a grueling march through Anatolia. The river he entered, the Salif, originates in the Taurus Mountains, and, even in June, its waters would have been dangerously cold from snowmelt. The sudden immersion of an overheated, exhausted, and elderly person into icy water is a textbook recipe for a medical catastrophe. Scholars speculate he may have suffered a fatal heart attack from the shock. Another compelling theory is hydrocution syndrome, or cold water shock, where the sudden cold triggers an involuntary gasp, causing the victim to inhale water and drown almost instantly. This would explain how he could have drowned so quickly, even in water that may have been relatively shallow, neatly reconciling the Christian and Muslim accounts. In the end, what's clear is that this legendary Holy Roman Emperor wasn't struck down by an enemy. Rather, this old lion was felled by a fatal intersection of his age, his exhaustion, and the unforgiving environment. The immediate aftermath of Barbarossa's death was as chaotic as the death itself was sudden. The emperor was the charismatic heart of the expedition, and without him, the army's morale completely collapsed. The massive German army, which had struck terror into its enemies, simply disintegrated and returned home. Of his massive elite force, only a few thousand would continue to participate in the crusade, which would fail to retake Jerusalem. In the end, whatever truly happened, it appears that a single freak accident in a remote Anatolian river on June 10th, 1190, would completely change the course of history. It's a high pass in the Pyrenees Mountains in the year 778, and the sun glints off the armor of the greatest ruler of the age, Charlemagne, king of the Franks. At his side hangs a sword unlike any other, a blade so magnificent it seems to pulse with its own inner light. This is Joyeuse, the Joyful, a weapon that would become as legendary as the man who wielded it. In the grand medieval epics like the Song of Roland, this sword was a character in its own right, a symbol of divine authority and terrifying power. It's a story that begins in the realm of epic poetry, but ends under the quiet, climate-controlled lights of the Louvre in Paris. According to the legendary tales passed down through the generations, the sword possessed truly supernatural qualities. It was said to shine so brightly that it could outshine the sun itself, blinding Charlemagne's enemies on the battlefield and leaving them helpless before the Frankish charge. Some storytellers claimed it could change color up to 30 times a day, shifting its hue with the mood of the battle or the will of its master. Beyond its dazzling appearance, it was also said to grant its wielder immunity from poison, a practical and priceless defense for a ruler in an age of courtly intrigue. In the language of medieval literature, such attributes were a clear signal of heavenly favor, marking Charlemagne as God's chosen king and then emperor. The sword's mythic power was rooted in its very substance. The most potent legends claimed that its golden pommel encased a holy relic of immense power, a piece of the lance of Longinus, the very spear that pierced the side of Christ. This transformed Joyeuse from a simple weapon of war into a sacred reliquary that traveled with the first Holy Roman Emperor. Every time Charlemagne drew his sword, he wasn't just preparing for battle, he was brandishing a symbol of the divine, making his conquests a holy mandate. Its origins were equally storied, with some tales attributing its creation to the mythical smith Wayland. Others name a craftsman named Gallus, who supposedly labored for 3 years to perfect the blade. While the magical properties of Joyeuse belong to legend, the idea of Charlemagne possessing a sword of extraordinary quality is firmly grounded in historical reality. In the Frankish society of the 8th and 9th centuries, a sword was far more than a tool. It was the preeminent symbol of a free man's status, a sign of wealth and authority that was often passed down as a treasured family heirloom. For an emperor who forged a new European order, his personal sword would have been the ultimate expression of that power. The Carolingian Empire was, in fact, the epicenter of advanced sword manufacturing in Europe. Frankish blades were renowned for their quality, so much so that they were highly coveted by their fiercest enemies, the Vikings, who sought them out through trade or as spoils of combat. The pinnacle of this Frankish technological supremacy can be seen in a group of blades known today as Ulfbert swords. Originating from workshops in the Rhineland, these weapons were forged from high-carbon crucible steel. This was a material of such purity and strength that its quality wouldn't be consistently replicated in Europe until the Industrial Revolution nearly 1,000 years later. The existence of these real-life super swords from Charlemagne's era provides a crucial context for the Joyeuse legend. The myth can be seen as a cultural echo of the Carolingian Empire's very real technological and military dominance. It was a story that broadcast Frankish superiority through the compelling medium of epic poetry. When we turn from the legend to the artifact resting in the Louvre, the story becomes one of evolution and adaptation. The historical consensus is clear. The sword on display is a composite object, an assembly of parts from different eras, with none dating back to the time of Charlemagne. This physical evidence is the most compelling argument against it being the emperor's personal weapon. The object we see today is more like a living document than a weapon, modified over centuries to suit the needs of its later owners. Nothing about the weapon on display today was created in the 8th century. A close examination reveals a timeline written in its very components. The blade itself is a style with a broad, tapering profile that was common in the 10th and 11th centuries. The ornate golden pommel, decorated with a motif of birds, also dates to this period and shows stylistic influences from Scandinavian art. The crossguard, fashioned into two stylized winged dragons with lapis lazuli eyes, is a later addition from the 12th century. The grip was added even later, likely in the 13th or 14th century, and was once adorned with the fleur-de-lis of the French monarchy. These were removed for the coronation of Napoleon in 1804 to symbolically show a break from the traditional French monarchy. Finally, the scabbard's oldest elements date to the 13th century, with elements being added on as late as the early 19th century. While the sword in the Louvre wasn't Charlemagne's, it played a far more significant and verifiable role in French history as the official coronation sword. The French coronation ceremony was a profoundly important ritual that affirmed a king's divine right to rule. A key part of this was establishing a direct, unbroken line of succession from Charlemagne, the symbolic father of France, Germany, and of the European order as a whole. This sword that is currently on display became the physical embodiment of that link. Its first documented appearance in a coronation was for Philip III in 1270. From that moment on, it was a centerpiece of the royal regalia, stored in the treasury of the Basilica of Saint-Denis and brought out for the crowning of each new king. The choice to identify this particular sword as Joyeuse was a masterful act of political theater. In the 13th century, the Capetian dynasty was working to centralize its authority and forge a stronger unified French identity. By adopting a tangible relic supposedly from the hand of the great emperor, they were able to legitimize their own rule in a powerful, undeniable way. When a new king was girded with Joyeuse, he was symbolically inheriting the mantle of Charlemagne himself. The sword in the Louvre is both the real sword and not the real Joyeuse at the same time. The dating of every single one of its components post-dates Charlemagne's reign, and there are no contemporary records from his lifetime that even mention a sword by that name. While Charlemagne undoubtedly possessed numerous swords of unsurpassed quality, the one in the Louvre isn't one of them. The legend of Joyeuse enters the historical record centuries later, born from the epic poetry that romanticized the Carolingian age. But to dismiss the sword as a fake is to miss the point entirely, and its historical inauthenticity does nothing to diminish its immense cultural significance. The true importance of the Louvre sword isn't derived from who might have wielded it in the 9th century. Rather, it came from the centuries of belief, ceremony, and national identity that were invested in it as being the true weapon of one of the most influential people in history. The myth of this sword is ultimately not about Charlemagne the man, but about the enduring power of Charlemagne the idea. It's January in the year of 1077, and the world is frozen. Atop a windswept hill in northern Italy, inside the fortress of Canossa, Pope Gregory VII waits. He is a man of fierce, unbending will, a reformer who believes he is God's chosen instrument to purify a corrupt world. Outside the castle gates, in the biting wind and deep snow, stands another man, Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful secular ruler in Christendom. But he isn't here as a conqueror. He is stripped of his royal robes, clad in a simple penitent's hair shirt, and most shockingly, he is barefoot. For 3 days, the emperor of the Western world has stood in the snow, fasting and weeping, begging the Pope for forgiveness. This incredible scene, the ultimate humiliation of a king before a pontiff, was the climax of a titanic struggle over who held ultimate authority on earth. How did the papacy, centuries removed from its origins as a persecuted sect, gain the power to bring an emperor to his knees? The answer is a complex story of faith, politics, and ambition. But one of its most crucial foundations wasn't a sacred text or a legitimate treaty. It was a lie. This is the story of the donation of Constantine, arguably the most influential and audacious forgery in human history, a fake decree that shaped a millennium. Known formally as the Constitutum Constantini, the document that would rock the medieval world was a brilliant piece of political fiction, likely crafted sometime around 750. It's composed of two parts, each serving a distinct purpose. The first, the Confessio, is a dramatic narrative. It tells a moving tale of the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, being struck down by leprosy. His pagan priests, it claims, proposed a horrifying cure, a bath filled with the blood of innocents. Constantine, recoiling in horror, refused. That night, the apostles Peter and Paul appeared to him in a dream, telling him to seek out Pope Sylvester I. The emperor obeyed, and Sylvester, after instructing him in the Christian faith, cured him completely through the holy sacrament of baptism. This entire story is a fabrication, borrowed from a popular 5th century legend, as credible historical sources show Constantine was actually baptized on his deathbed. But the story's emotional power was the perfect setup for the document's explosive second half, the donation itself. And trust me when I say it, this reads like a Christmas wish list for a medieval pope hoping to seize as much temporal authority and power as humanly possible. Presented as Constantine's gesture of immense gratitude, this section lays out a breathtaking transfer of power. First, it grants the Pope spiritual supremacy over all other major Christian centers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem, and indeed over every church in the world. Keep this list of major Christian centers in your mind for later, because you'll see, one of these things was not like the others. Next, it bestows upon Sylvester and his successors the symbols and status of imperial majesty. It gave them the Lateran palace, the right to wear the imperial purple cloak and a jeweled tiara, and the dignity of Roman senators. In a gesture of profound deference, the text even claims Constantine acted as the Pope's personal groom, leading his horse by the bridle. Then comes the grand prize. The document declares that Constantine gives to the Pope direct political dominion over, quote, the city of Rome, and all the provinces, places, and cities of Italy and the western regions. To seal this monumental gift, Constantine allegedly explains that he is moving his capital to the east, founding Constantinople. This is curious because the forgery gives the Pope dominion over Constantinople, which is explained to be a major Christian center on par with Jerusalem. Again, keep this in mind, because this little mistake will end up unraveling this forgery in one of the most fascinating ways possible. The reason for this move is explicitly stated that it's not right for a secular emperor to hold power in the city where God has established the supreme head of the Christian religion. It was a total package, a forgery of genius that didn't just grant land, but also a divine backstory, imperial status, and a neat justification for the new geopolitical reality of Europe. To understand why such an extraordinary document was created, we have to go back to the desperate crisis facing the papacy in the mid-8th century. The popes in Rome were in a perilous position. The Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, their traditional protector, was distracted by significant issues and offered little support. Meanwhile, a Germanic tribe known as the Lombards were aggressively expanding their territory in Italy, threatening the very gates of Rome. In a moment of strategic genius, Pope Stephen II looked not east, but north of the Alps for a new champion, Pepin the Short, the ambitious mayor of the Palace of the Franks. He wanted to be king, but he needed a higher authority to legitimize his official overthrow of the ruling Merovingian dynasty. The Pope needed a protector, a grand bargain was struck. In 754, Stephen traveled to Francia and personally anointed Pepin as king of the Franks. With this, he sanctioned his new Carolingian dynasty with divine approval, in a foreshadowing of the founding of the Holy Roman Empire decades later. In return, Pepin marched his army into Italy, crushed the Lombards, and gave the conquered territories to the Pope. This donation of Pepin was the historical event that created the Papal States, lands the popes would rule for the next 1,100 years. It is almost certain that the donation of Constantine was forged specifically for these negotiations, though it may have been done in the century after to retroactively make it legitimate. With this document in hand, the Pope could argue that Pepin the Short wasn't giving him a new gift. He was simply restoring lands that had rightfully belonged to the Church since the 4th century. It transformed the Pope from a grateful subordinate into a sovereign reclaiming his stolen property. For the next 700 years, the forgery worked its magic numerous times. In 1054, it played a direct role in the Great Schism, the final split between the Catholic West and Orthodox East. In a letter to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Pope Leo IX cited large portions of the donation to assert his universal authority. The Eastern Church, of course, had no copies of any such document, and they flatly rejected it, hardening the divisions that led to the schism. A few decades later, the document's ideology reached its zenith during the investiture controversy. The Pope cited this document as giving him the authority to choose and install bishops, as well as depose kings, and most controversially, even the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Notably, in the understanding of the time, the Holy Roman Emperor was seen as the temporal equivalent to the Pope. The two together were supposedly the supreme authorities in Christendom, one on a temporal basis, and the other on a spiritual basis. The donation had created a powerful historical quote-unquote memory of an emperor submitting to a pope. The scene of Henry IV barefoot at Canossa was, in a sense, the real-world reenactment of the donation's fictional premise. But lies, no matter how powerful, eventually face the light of truth when they're built on a shaky foundation. The definitive takedown came in 1440, at the height of the Italian Renaissance, when knowledge of Roman history was expanding greatly. Lorenzo Valla, a brilliant priest and humanist scholar, published a treatise that systematically demolished the forgery, not with theology, but with evidence. Valla pioneered the new science of philology, the critical analysis of language and texts. He proved that the Latin used in the donation was not the elegant classical Latin of the 4th century, but a later, more barbarous form common in the 8th century. He pointed out anachronistic words that a 4th century Roman would never have used. For instance, the donation spoke of a fief, a word and concept that didn't exist then. To the 8th century forger, though, the idea of a fiefdom was just so ingrained that they couldn't imagine a world built on an administrative order rather than a feudal order. Valla then moved to more glaring historical errors. The document, he noted with surgical precision, spoke of Constantinople as a great religious center on par with Jerusalem, Antioch, or Alexandria. There was just one problem with this. At the supposed time of its writing, the city hadn't even been founded yet, and it was just a backwater called Byzantium. By the 8th century, however, Constantinople was the foremost city of Christendom, and asserting the Pope's authority over the Patriarch of Constantinople was a key element of the document. Had Constantinople not been mentioned, this would have weakened the purpose of the forgery. Finally, he appealed to logic. He questioned why there were no other records of this enormous event. After all, if the document were true, it would mean that the Pope was, in essence, the Western Roman Emperor. There were no coins minted by the popes showing their authority, no administrative histories from this so-called state, and no mention by any contemporary writer. It was, he concluded, an impossibility. Vala's work was a landmark, establishing that critical inquiry could topple centuries of authority. Vala's treatise circulated in manuscript for decades and was actively suppressed by the Church. It was finally formally printed and distributed in 1517, the very year Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. For the burgeoning Protestant Reformation, the discovery was a godsend. Reformers like Luther seized upon it as the ultimate proof of their claims, that the papacy was a corrupt worldly institution built on a foundation of lies. For Luther, learning that the donation was a fraud was a profound shock, helping to convince him that the Pope might even be the Antichrist himself. During the Counter-Reformation, the Church ceased using the document in international relations. The earliest official admission inside the Church itself was by Cardinal Baronius in 1592, when he wrote that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. Despite this, the Church continued to commission art depicting an event that they themselves admitted to be false for centuries after. Astonishingly, the Church didn't formally publicly admit that the donation of Constantine was a forgery until 1929. Pretend you're a sailor in the year 678. You serve in the mighty fleet of the Umayyad Caliphate, an unstoppable force that has conquered half the known world in a single generation. For 5 years, your armada has besieged the crown jewel of Christendom, the city of Constantinople. Its fall is inevitable. Today, the small, outmatched Byzantine fleet sails out to meet you, a final, desperate act before their empire is extinguished once and for all. But as their ships draw near, something impossible happens. From bronze tubes mounted on their prows, often shaped like the roaring heads of lions, erupts a thick, hissing stream of liquid fire. It's accompanied by a thunderous roar and clouds of smoke. The sticky substance slams into your vessel, clinging to the wood, the sails, and the skin of your comrades. Men become living torches. Then comes the true horror. As sailors douse the flames with buckets of seawater, the fire doesn't die. Panic erupts. Men leap into the sea to escape the flames, only to find the water itself ablaze, preferring to drown rather than be consumed by this inferno. This was the world's introduction to Greek fire, a weapon so terrifying it felt as if the very fires of hell had been unleashed. The emergence of this revolutionary weapon couldn't have come at a more critical moment. By the mid-7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire was on the brink of collapse. Exhausted by decades of war with the Sassanid Persians, it faced an existential threat from the lightning-fast expansion of the Arab caliphates. The vital provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had already fallen, and now massive Arab fleets were at the gates of Constantinople, threatening the heart of the empire. The survival of the city, and arguably the entirety of the future of Western civilization, hung by a single increasingly tenuous thread. It was in this desperate hour that Greek fire turned the tide. And just a quick note on its name: while the Eastern Roman Empire is now known as the Byzantine Empire, this name wouldn't have been familiar to the people at the time. These people referred to their empire as the Roman Empire and referred to themselves as Romans. During the great Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, the Roman navy, though often outnumbered, used the weapon to annihilate the attacking fleets. They secured victories that have been cited as a prime reason for the eastern portion of this ancient empire's long survival. But the true nature of this weapon has long been debated by historians and those who actually saw it in action themselves. The traditional story, recorded by the chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, credits its invention around 672, to a man named Callinicos. According to him, he was a Hellenized Jewish architect who fled to Constantinople from Heliopolis in Syria after it was overrun. However, modern historical consensus has added a crucial layer of nuance to this tale. Theophanes himself mentions Byzantine ships equipped with fire-projecting siphons before Callinicos' supposed arrival. This suggests that Greek fire wasn't a singular invention born in a flash of genius. Instead, it was more likely the culmination of centuries of Hellenistic knowledge in chemistry and engineering, possibly inherited from the great scientific schools of Alexandria. Callinicos' true contribution was potentially perfecting an existing incendiary formula, or perhaps it was something even greater than this. Some historians have speculated that he engineered the complex delivery system that transformed it from a localized threat into a decisive, battle-winning superweapon. While its exact formula was a state secret so closely guarded that it was ultimately lost to history, modern scholarship and experimental archaeology have pieced together a compelling picture. The overwhelming consensus is that Greek fire was a petroleum-based mixture. Its main ingredient was almost certainly crude oil, or a distilled variant like naphtha, which the Byzantines could readily access from natural wells around the Black Sea. This base was likely mixed with other ingredients to enhance its terrifying properties. Pine resin was probably added as a thickening agent, making the liquid sticky and ensuring it would adhere to any surface it touched. Other potential additives include sulfur and, most intriguingly, quicklime. The addition of quicklime, or calcium oxide, is a key theory because its violent, heat-generating reaction with water could have provided a self-ignition mechanism. This provides an explanation for the legend that the substance was actually ignited by contact with water, rather than simply spreading on water. However, the secret to Greek fire's success wasn't just its chemical composition. Its true genius lay in the fact that it was a complete weapon system, a synthesis of chemistry, engineering, and tactical doctrine that enemies found impossible to replicate. The primary platform for this system was the dromon, a specialized, fast-moving Byzantine galley. These galleys were purpose-built for combat in the eastern Mediterranean Sea and were highly maneuverable. Hidden below the decks of these ships was the heart of the weapon. There was a complex apparatus that likely consisted of a brazier to preheat the volatile liquid, a bronze pump to pressurize it, and a nozzle mounted on a swivel on the prow. This machinery allowed a highly trained and sophisticated crew to project a continuous, aimed stream of fire over distances of up to 50 feet. The technology was also remarkably adaptable. Emperor Leo VI himself is credited with inventing the kyrosophon, a portable, handheld version that functioned as an early flamethrower. Now, just a quick note on this. The emperor himself drafted a military treatise called the Tactica, where he himself claimed that he invented this item. Some historians doubt this was the case, instead believing that he may have sponsored the actual individual who came up with this innovation. That said, the emperor himself is our only source whatsoever on the invention of this. The historians who doubt this are likely doing so on the basis that an emperor wouldn't have time to devote to the research and engineering required for such an invention. This weapon was extremely devastating against siege towers and tightly packed enemy formations. Formations that were struck with a blast from the kyrosophon would naturally break rank, as staying too close together would allow the flames to spread. The Roman formations could then exploit this weakness to maximum effectiveness. The Byzantines also filled ceramic pots with the substance, creating incendiary grenades that could be hurled by hand or catapult. This multifaceted system explains why enemies who captured samples of the liquid or even entire siphons were unable to turn the weapon against its creators. They had captured a component, but not the entire system, which required specialized knowledge in metallurgy, engineering, and operation that remained a closely guarded secret. The Byzantines protected this technological advantage with a pioneering strategy of information control that blended practical security with sophisticated propaganda. The production of Greek fire was centralized in Constantinople and highly compartmentalized. The chemists who mixed the formula were kept separate from the engineers who built the siphons. These two groups were in turn separate from the specially trained sailors and engineers who operated the device in the field. This ensured that no single captured individual could betray the entire system. To reinforce this practical security, the state cultivated a powerful origin myth. In the 10th century, Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos wrote in a manual for his son that the formula wasn't a human invention at all. Instead, it was a divine secret revealed by an angel to a previous emperor. The angel, he claimed, commanded that the fire must only be used by Christians against enemies of God, specifically in defense of the imperial city and Roman interests. This narrative transformed technological theft into an act of profound sacrilege, a sin against God himself, creating a powerful religious and psychological deterrent against betrayal. That said, modern historians believe it was the compartmentalization element that was much more effective in keeping the reality of Greek fire under wraps. Ultimately, the flame of this legendary weapon was extinguished not on the battlefield, but by the slow decay of the empire that created it. Its use becomes sporadic after the 12th century, and it is notably absent during the catastrophic Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Western Crusaders sacked Constantinople. During this period, the city of Constantinople was taken over, and a feudal Western European state called the Latin Empire was established. During this period, many of the Greek-speaking residents of the city fled to the Greek successor states, such as the Empire of Nicaea. This devastating blow shattered the centralized state, likely destroying the workshops, scattering the technicians, and severing the fragile chain of secret knowledge. While the Empire of Nicaea would eventually re-establish and restore the Byzantine Empire, the last 2 centuries were the long twilight of a fading star. Crippling trade concessions to Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa had already weakened the restored Roman Empire's naval power and the state's finances. This made it difficult to maintain the expensive, specialized fleets required to deploy Greek fire. The loss of territories around the Black Sea may have also cut off access to the essential raw materials, particularly the crude oil that formed the weapon's base. Notably, while it's often assumed that the weapon became obsolete due to the advent of cannons, Greek fire was already lost centuries prior. Ultimately, Greek fire was a reflection of Byzantine might, and as the empire crumbled, so too did its ability to wield its most iconic weapon. The story of Greek fire isn't just the tale of a lost recipe or the question of how come Roman enemies could never replicate this medieval superweapon. For over 500 years, it was a symbol of Byzantine ingenuity and a cornerstone of its defense, a weapon that saved an empire and shaped the course of history. Its disappearance serves as a stark reminder that the most advanced technology is fragile and dependent on the stable, prosperous, and secure civilization that supports it. In the late summer of 1066, a formidable fleet of over 300 longships sliced through the waters of the North Sea, their dragon-headed prows pointed towards England. At the helm of this great armada stood Harold Sigurdsson, King of Norway, a man known to history by a name he had earned through a lifetime of ruthless ambition, Hard Rada, the Hard Ruler. At 50 years old, he was a living legend, a giant of a man that contemporaries claimed stood over 7 feet tall, the last of the great Viking warrior kings. This was no mere raid for plunder. This was a full-scale invasion, a kingdom-wide mobilization so serious that Hardrada had brought his own family. He intended to plant his banner on English soil and stay. He came not just with swords, but with a story, a claim to the English throne passed down through a chain of treaties and inheritances. But as his fleet neared the coast, the central question of his legacy hung in the salt-laced air. Was this the righteous quest of a legitimate heir seeking his rightful inheritance, or was it the final audacious gamble of a battle-hardened opportunist whose claim was forged in iron? Harold Hardrada's entire life was based on a relentless pursuit of power. His story begins not with an easy ascension to a throne, but in the mud of defeat. In 1030, at the tender age of 15, he fought alongside his half-brother, Saint Olaf, at the Battle of Stiklestad. This was a failed bid to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the Danish king, Canute the Great. Wounded and on the losing side, the young Harold was forced into a 15-year exile that would serve as his brutal education in the realities of power. His path led him east, first to the court of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kievan Rus, where the prince quickly proved his military worth and became a captain of Yaroslav's forces. From there, his ambition took him to the glittering heart of the medieval world, Constantinople, or as the Norse called it, Miklagard, the great city. Here, Hardrada joined the Varangian Guard, the elite axe-wielding bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. He excelled, rising to become the commander of this legendary mercenary unit. For nearly a decade, he saw action across the vast frontiers of the empire, from campaigns against Saracen pirates in the Mediterranean to quelling rebellions in Bulgaria. His ferocity earned him the fearsome moniker Harold the Bulgar Burner amongst both his friends and his foes. Interestingly, his exploits are chronicled not only in the Norse sagas, but also in Byzantine records from a writer and general named Kekamenos. He served alongside him and described him as an honorable and brave leader worthy of his royal status. Throughout this service, he amassed an immense fortune, which he shrewdly sent back to the lands of Yaroslavl for safekeeping. This long, violent apprenticeship as a soldier of fortune fundamentally shaped his perspective. For Hardrada, kingship wasn't a birthright to be passively inherited, but a prize to be won through military might, strategic cunning, and sheer force of will. When he finally returned to Norway in 1046, he didn't wait for an invitation. He used his vast wealth and intimidating reputation to force his own nephew, King Magnus the Good, into a co-rulership. When Magnus died a year later under somewhat suspicious circumstances, Hardrada became the sole, undisputed king. He approached the throne of England with this same mercenary mindset. It was the ultimate campaign, and his legal claim was simply the justification for the conflict he was born to fight. On its face, Harold Hardrada's legal argument for the English crown was built upon a specific, if remote, diplomatic agreement. The case begins with his predecessor, King Magnus the Good of Norway, and Harthacnut, the Anglo-Danish king of England and Denmark, and son of Canute the Great. In the late 1030s, these two rulers were locked in a bitter dispute for control of Denmark. To avert a costly war, they reportedly forged a treaty around 1038. The core of this pact was a succession clause. Should either king die without a male heir, the survivor would inherit the other's entire domain. This agreement was put to the test in 1042 when Harthacnut collapsed and died at a wedding feast, leaving no children. True to the treaty, Magnus of Norway was acknowledged as the new king of Denmark. At that time, Magnus also declared his right to the English throne as part of Harthacnut's inheritance. However, he never acted on it. The English magnates, showing little regard for a Scandinavian pact, had already moved to restore the old Wessex dynasty by crowning Edward the Confessor king. When Magnus himself died in 1047, Harald Hardrada succeeded him as King of Norway. In Hardrada's view, he inherited not just the Norwegian crown, but all of Magnus's titles and legal claims, including the dormant one to England, derived from the treaty with Harthacnut. Thus, when Edward the Confessor died childless in 1066, Hardrada argued that the old pact was now due. The English crown, he reasoned, should have rightfully passed from Harthacnut to Magnus, and therefore now belonged to him as Magnus's heir. It was a neat logical chain, at least from a Norwegian perspective. The fatal weakness in this argument, however, was the unproven and highly convenient assumption that the treaty ever included England at all. Further, even if it did, the Anglo-Saxons had no say in this, and their cultural traditions were much different, as I'll get to in a moment. Whatever the terms of the Magnus Harthacnut Pact, it was utterly irrelevant to the English. The 1066 succession crisis was, at its heart, a collision of three distinct legal and political cultures. Hardrada's claim was by far the most alien to the established traditions associated with the English crown. In Anglo-Saxon England, the crown was not a piece of personal property that a king could bargain away in a foreign treaty without the consent of his people. Succession was not determined by strict automatic rules of primogeniture, but was a more fluid and political process. The ultimate authority in the matter rested with the Witenagemot, an Anglo-Saxon word meaning the meeting of wise men, that I'll just refer to as the council from here on out. This great council, comprising the most powerful earls and bishops in the realm, had the duty to advise the king, and most critically, to elect his successor. While candidates were chosen from the extended royal family, the council's primary goal was to select the man best equipped to rule and defend the kingdom. Furthermore, a previous king's nomination carried immense legal and moral weight with the council. According to every English source, on January 5, 1066, the dying king Edward the Confessor named the most powerful man in the kingdom, Harold Godwinson, as his heir. The very next day the council convened, formally elected Godwinson, and he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. By the laws and customs of England, this sequence of events, royal designation confirmed by council election, made Harold Godwinson the one and only legitimate king. From this English legal standpoint, Hardrada's claim, based on a second-hand interpretation of a foreign pact, was not a serious legal challenge. It was the pretext for an invasion. A weak claim, however, can become a potent threat when combined with opportunity and a powerful, vengeful ally. For Harold Hardrada, that ally was Tostig Godwinson, the exiled and embittered brother of the new English king. Tostig had been appointed Earl of Northumbria in 1055, but his rule over the fiercely independent Anglo-Danish North was disastrous. As a southerner, he failed to understand the region's unique customs, and his tenure was marked by heavy taxation, frequent absences, and noble and popular uprisings. In October 1065, the leading nobles of Northumbria rose in open rebellion, declared Tostig an outlaw, and demanded he be replaced by a local magnate, Morcar. King Edward ordered Harold Godwinson to march north and crush the revolt. But Harold, ever the pragmatist and likely seeing the need for a united kingdom against the looming threat of William of Normandy, chose a different path. He met with the rebels, acknowledged the justice of their cause, and persuaded the king to accept their terms. Tostig was stripped of his earldom and banished from England. Feeling utterly betrayed by the brother who had sided with his enemies, Tostig embarked on a quest for revenge. He first sought an alliance with William of Normandy, which failed. Then he attempted his own raids on the English coast, but was easily repelled. Finally, he sailed to Norway. There, he found a receptive audience in Harald Hardrada. Sources suggest the Norwegian king was initially hesitant, having just concluded a long and draining war with Denmark. But Tostig was persuasive. He offered Hardrada not only his support, but also critical intelligence. He claimed that the Anglo-Danish population of northern England would rise up to support a new Viking king. Tostig's personal vendetta was the indispensable spark that ignited Hardrada's ambition and launched the great invasion fleet. With Tostig at his side, Hardrada's theoretical claim became a terrifying reality for Harold Godwinson. In September 1066, the Norwegian army landed unopposed and marched on York, the capital of the north. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, the very men who had replaced Tostig, hastily assembled an army to block their path. At the Battle of Fulford on September 20th, the English forces were annihilated. The Norwegian veterans, hardened by decades of conflict, shattered the English shield wall. The victory was total. York surrendered, and Hardrada began taking hostages, acting every bit the conquering king. This triumph, however, was short-lived. King Harold Godwinson responded with almost superhuman speed. In a legendary feat of military logistics, he force-marched his elite army nearly 200 miles north in just 4 days. On September 25th, he caught the Norwegian army completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge. The invaders, basking in their recent victory, were largely without their armor. According to the Norse sagas, before the fighting began, King Harold himself rode out and offered his brother Tostig a full pardon and the return of his lands. When Tostig asked what he would offer King Harold of Norway, the reply was chillingly prophetic. According to legend, he would offer Hardrada 7 feet of English ground for his eternal rest, quipping that he needed extra space since he was so tall. By the end of the day, both Hardrada, struck in the throat by an arrow, and Tostig lay dead. The Viking army was so utterly destroyed that of the 300 ships that had arrived, only somewhere around 25 ended up making the return voyage. In the final analysis, Harold Hardrada's claim to the English throne was legally baseless by the standards of the kingdom he sought to rule. It relied on a foreign pact that the English nobility never recognized, and ignored the established authority of the council that chose Anglo-Saxon kings. Yet, while legally weak, the claim was made politically and militarily formidable by the character of the claimant. It was, in essence, a justification for one last great Viking adventure, an attempt to resurrect Canute's great North Sea empire through force of arms. And as a quick postscript, Harold Godwinson wouldn't be dropping witty one-liners for much longer. In his failed conquest, Harold Hardrada had a decisive impact on England's fate, and due to the importance of this island to the world, massively changed the entire course of history. His invasion forced King Harold Godwinson's army into a grueling 400-mile march and 2 battles in the space of a week. The English victory at Stamford Bridge came at a terrible cost, leaving Harold's army battered, exhausted, and far from the southern coast. In the end, the last great Viking king's quest for the throne virtually ensured it would fall to another man of Viking descent, William, Duke of Normandy. Sometime around the year 1000, on a grassy terrace overlooking a bay at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, a Norseman felled a tree with an iron axe. Lonso Meadows contains the remains of 8 timber and sod buildings, including dwellings, workshops, and a forge, the first known site of iron smelting in the New World. Over 800 artifacts of clear Norse origin have been unearthed, from a bronze cloak pin to women's jewelry. But this wasn't just a colony. It was a base camp, a waypoint for repairing ships, and crucially, for launching exploratory voyages further south. The discovery of butternuts, a type of walnut that doesn't grow north of modern-day New Brunswick, confirms that these Norse explorers did indeed venture deeper into the continent. This raises the question of just how much further these Viking explorers may have pushed into the Americas. Some believe these master seafarers may have pushed their ships south, past the shores of New England, beyond the Caribbean, and into the world of the Maya and the Toltecs. The idea that Vikings reached Mesoamerica is a powerful and persistent one, fueled by a collection of tantalizing but ultimately problematic clues. At the heart of this theory lies the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the most important deities in the Mesoamerican pantheon. According to post-conquest legends, Quetzalcoatl was sometimes depicted as a pale-skinned, bearded man who arrived from the sea. He taught the people arts and sciences, and promised one day to return from the east. Proponents of the Viking theory seize upon this description, suggesting it matches a lost Norse explorer who washed ashore and was deified by the local population. Some have even tried to draw a linguistic line between the Norse god Odin, also known as Woden, and a regional Maya deity known as Votan, claiming it as proof of a cultural exchange. This central myth is often supported by other highly interpretive evidence. At the great Maya city of Chichen Itza, murals within the Temple of the Warriors depict complex battle scenes. Some observers note light-skinned, blonde-haired figures among the warriors, either fighting, being taken captive, or sacrificed. The Icelandic sagas tell the tale of a Norseman who was driven far to the southwest by a storm and was last seen as a chieftain in a mysterious, warm, foreign land. Adding to this speculative evidence is a bizarre physical object, the Takaxic Kalixtlahuaca head. This small terracotta head, which some believe may be of Roman origin, was reportedly discovered in 1933 in a pre-Columbian grave in central Mexico. Since Vikings traveled and traded throughout the Eastern Roman world, some have suggested the head could have been a cherished souvenir. However, the chain of custody on this item is disputed, and this has been a one-of-a-kind find. When we move from the realm of interpretation to the sciences of archaeology, genetics, and historiography, the case for Vikings in Mexico becomes much weaker. The contrast with Lonso Meadows is stark. The evidence in Newfoundland is physical, testable, and unambiguous. The evidence in Mexico is entirely subjective and interpretive, and in the case of the head, may simply be a fraud. Decades of intensive excavation across Mexico and Central America have unearthed millions of artifacts from the Olmec, Maya, Toltec, and Aztec civilizations. Not one of them is of confirmed Norse origin. There are no iron boat rivets, no runic inscriptions on stone, no Norse tools, weapons, or burials. The Takaxic Kalixtlahuaca head, the supposed hard evidence, is a textbook example of an out-of-place artifact with fatally flawed provenance. It was allegedly found in 1933, but not reported until 1960, and the original excavation was poorly documented with no photographs. There's also a claim that the head was placed there not as an actual fraud or hoax, but as a practical joke on one of the archaeologists on the dig. Modern scientific testing does suggest the head is actually ancient, but of course this doesn't necessarily prove pre-Columbian arrival given the custody issues. There's also the matter of the genetic footprint, which arguably tells a fairly definitive story. Modern genetic analysis allows scientists to trace ancient population movements with incredible precision. Norse migrations left a clear genetic signature across the North Atlantic in the DNA of modern populations in the British Isles, Iceland, and parts of Russia. Yet, extensive genetic surveys of both modern and ancient DNA from indigenous Mesoamerican populations show no trace of Norse or any other European ancestry prior to Columbus. On the other side of the Atlantic, Some modern Icelanders are the descendants of a Native American woman who was brought back to Iceland. However, she was likely from Newfoundland, and definitely not from Mesoamerica. That said, if the Norse were captured and sacrificed, this may explain their lack of any genetic impact. Finally, the Quetzalcoatl myth itself, when properly examined, predates the Vikings by more than a millennium. The popular image of a white bearded god who promised to return isn't found in any authentic pre-Columbian sources. That's not to say it didn't actually exist, given the mass destruction of pre-Columbian artifacts by the Spanish, but many propose a different origin of the story. Under this theory, the narrative was a post-conquest invention, likely created and promoted by Spanish friars in the 16th century. Under this theory, the idea was spread to imply that Quetzalcoatl was actually Jesus Christ, making the arrival of the Spanish a divine prophecy fulfilled. Even if one were to ignore the complete lack of physical proof, the logistical and geopolitical realities of the 11th century make a Viking voyage to Mexico a near impossibility. The primary obstacle was the ocean itself. The entire eastern seaboard of North America is dominated by the Gulf Stream. This is a massive and powerful current that flows like a river heading northward in the ocean. A Viking ship attempting to sail south from New England would have been fighting directly against a current flowing at up to 6 miles per hour. This would have been a monumental challenge for a vessel with a single square sail and oars. This wall of water would have made a southbound journey incredibly slow and arduous, if not impossible. After a thorough review of the archaeological, genetic, historical, and logistical evidence, the verdict is clear. There's no credible scientific proof to support the theory that Vikings ever reached Mexico or Central America. While there are tantalizing morsels of highly speculative evidence, at the end of the day, at present, it's much more likely than not that no Vikings ever got to Central America. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Also, don't forget that you can toss me a clam or two through the YouTube membership by clicking that join button. Close your eyes and picture a Viking. The image that springs to mind is almost certainly a towering bearded warrior, clad in furs and leather, brandishing a fearsome axe. And on his head, he's of course wearing a helmet. That popular culture would have you believe is crowned with a pair of intimidating curved horns. This warrior is an icon, a staple of everything from cartoons to sports team mascots. He's powerful, instantly recognizable, and utterly wrong. The horned helmet, the single most defining feature of the pop culture Viking, is a complete fabrication. It's a piece of 19th century stagecraft that has successfully masqueraded as history for 150 years. Our investigation begins where all historical truth must, with the physical evidence. When it comes to Viking headgear, the archaeological record is remarkably quiet, but what it does say is decisive. To date, only one complete, verifiable combat helmet from the entire Viking Age has ever been discovered. Unearthed in 1943 from a chieftain's burial mound at Norway, this 10th century artifact is our gold standard. It was found among the cremated remains of a wealthy warrior, accompanied by a full suit of chainmail, swords, spears, and axes, the gear of a true military elite. The helmet itself is a masterpiece of practical, deadly design. It's a rounded iron cap built in the Spangenhelm style from 4 interlocking plates, designed to deflect sword blows. A distinctive guard protects the eyes and nose without obscuring vision. It's a functional piece of hardware, showing evidence of battle damage that confirms its use in actual combat. Every element has a distinct and defined purpose that offers protection to the warrior. This isn't to say horned helmets are entirely alien to Scandinavian history. They did exist, but the people who wore them lived in a world so ancient that the Vikings themselves would have considered it the stuff of legend. In 1942, two magnificent bronze helmets were pulled from a peat bog in Viksø, Denmark. They're elegant, decorated with the eyes and beak of a bird of prey, and feature gracefully curving horns. They are also from the Nordic Bronze Age. Recent radiocarbon dating of birch tar used in their construction places them around 1000 BC, nearly 2,000 years before a Viking longship ever left port. These were not helmets for combat. They are far too thin and fragile to have stopped a weapon. Scholars believe they were worn by chieftains or priests during religious ceremonies, possibly to channel the power of animal deities. This tradition of adding horns to ceremonial helmets is thought to have continued on into the Viking Age. However, unlike horned helmets potentially worn by figures like the Teutonic Knights, these helmets have no historical basis for use in combat. The cultural and political currents of the 19th century would transform this ahistorical helmet into a prime part of Norse heritage. The era was defined by Romantic nationalism, a movement where nations sought to build a unique identity by looking back to a heroic, often mythologized, past. For countries like Sweden and Norway, the Viking Age became their golden era, a time of strength, adventure, and pure, untamed spirit. The historical Norseman, who often doubled as a farmer and trader, was reborn and romanticized as a heroic Viking warrior. The Viking was no longer a pre-modern pirate, but something to be proud of. Artists began creating dramatic, influential images of these newly heroic Vikings. Seeking to portray them as fierce and wild, they took artistic license and began adding horns and wings to their helmets, likely inspired by ancient ceremonial artifacts. It was German composer Richard Wagner, however, who launched the myth onto the world stage. The 1876 premiere of his monumental opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen, was a cultural earthquake. For this epic retelling of Germanic and Norse myths, the costume designer was tasked with creating a new, authentically Nordic look. Ironically, in his quest for historical inspiration, the designer made the same mistake, because he looked to the painter's work. To find out what an authentic Norseman looked like, he didn't turn to scholarship, but to the artists who had depicted heroic Vikings. The designer then created costumes that included both winged helmets for the heroic Valkyries and horned helmets for the more brutish characters. Wagner himself reportedly hated the designs, challenging the historicity of them, but for reasons of time and money, they were used, and the opera was a colossal success. As it toured Europe and America, this vision became inseparable from the historical reality. Beyond the lack of archaeological evidence and the clear historical origins of the myth, there's a final, compelling argument against horned helmets: common sense. On a battlefield, they would have been a fatal liability. A helmet's primary purpose is to deflect blows, something the smooth, rounded shape of the complete Viking helmet does perfectly. Horns do the opposite. They risk catching an opponent's blade or axe, transferring the full, deadly force of the blow to the wearer's head and neck. They also provide a perfect, convenient handhold for an enemy to grab, allowing them to wrench your head and control your movement. In the crush of a shield wall or on the cramped deck of a longship, they would have snagged on everything: shields, rigging, weapons, and fellow warriors. In short, the historical consensus is clear. Horned helmets, to the extent they existed, were for ceremonial purposes only, not combat. The year 793 began with terror. According to the scribes of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the skies over the kingdom of Northumbria filled with dreadful signs. According to this source, there was everything from massive whirlwinds to sightings of multiple fire-breathing dragons in the sky. These terrifying portents were followed by a great famine, and for the anxious inhabitants, it must have felt as if the world itself was coming undone. On June 8th, 793, a brutal and shocking Viking assault on the monastery on the holy island of Lindisfarne would mark the traditional birth of the Viking Age. For over a millennium, historians accepted this as the dawn of the Viking era. However, new evidence suggests the age of the Norse raider began earlier. To understand why the raid on Lindisfarne had such a profound impact, one must first understand what the island represented. Lindisfarne was the sacred heart of Northumbrian Christianity, the very place where the faith had first taken root in the region. It was a preeminent center of learning and pilgrimage, made holy by its association with Saint Cuthbert, a revered bishop and miracle worker. For the Vikings to strike here was an assault on God himself in one of his holiest sanctuaries in the British Isles. News of the atrocity spread with shocking speed, sending a tremor of fear throughout Christian Europe. The most powerful voice of this horror belonged to Alcuin of York, a Northumbrian scholar serving at the court of the great Frankish emperor Charlemagne. In a series of anguished letters to the Northumbrian king Ethelred and Lindisfarne's bishop Higbald, Alcuin painted a visceral picture of the desecration. Yet Alcuin's reaction went beyond simple horror. He sought a theological explanation for how God could allow such a thing to happen. The answer, he concluded, lay not with the pagans, but with the sins of the Northumbrians themselves. The raid, he argued, was divine retribution. He chastised King Ethelred and his court for their luxurious habits and immoral behavior. One of the greatest offenses they had committed was trimming their beards and hair in a style that he viewed as distinctively pagan. He also pointed out that the Anglo-Saxons had been engaging in all sorts of immoralities, up to and including regicide. This framing ensured the event wasn't forgotten as just another coastal attack, but was instead amplified and recorded as an epoch-defining moment. For all its historical weight, the narrative of Lindisfarne as the absolute beginning of the Viking Age is challenged by compelling evidence of a more gradual and complex start. The most direct contradiction comes from the very same source that immortalized the 793 raid. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also records an earlier, fatal encounter with Norse raiders. During the reign of King Beorhtric of Wessex, sometime around the year 789, 3 ships of Northmen landed at Portland in Dorset. The local king's reeve, a man named Beatahard, rode out to meet them. Crucially, the chronicle notes that he intended to escort them to the king's town because, quote, he knew not what they were, assuming them to be traitors. For his trouble, the reeve and his men were slain. A survivor ended up reporting large-scale looting occurred after. The reeve's fatal misunderstanding is key. His assumption that the visitors were merchants implies that the sight of Scandinavian ships arriving peacefully for commerce was a known occurrence. He didn't see any threat, and actually wanted to give them an official escort to town for this trade. Archaeological discoveries have powerfully reinforced this idea. Well before 793, Scandinavia was already deeply integrated into a bustling North Sea economic network. Excavations at trading towns in Denmark reveal a sophisticated, planned marketplace in operation from as early as around 700. This evidence shows items from Britain and the Frankish Empire, likely proving that Norsemen were already accomplished seafarers. The iconic Viking longship was not a sudden invention, but the culmination of a long evolution in shipbuilding. Archaeological evidence suggests that primitive versions of the iconic longships existed by the end of the 7th century. The evidence strongly suggests that the start of the Viking Age wasn't marked by the first appearance of a longship off the European coast. Rather, the age began by a strategic and brutal shift in the behavior of the people on board. It was a change in their business model from primarily peaceful commerce to increasingly violent and opportunistic plunder. This shift from trader to raider wasn't caused by a single factor, but by a perfect storm of converging pressures and opportunities. A combination of push factors from within Scandinavia and pull factors from a vulnerable Europe created the conditions for an unprecedented wave of expansion. Within late 8th century Scandinavia, the political landscape was a fragmented patchwork of territories ruled by chieftains and petty kings. In this highly competitive society, a leader's power depended on his ability to attract and retain a band of loyal followers. As with all forms of Germanic kingship, this loyalty was secured through personal relationships formed on the basis of generosity, rather than anything resembling a modern state. This required the constant distribution of wealth in the form of silver, weapons, and luxury goods. Raiding abroad was a direct and effective way to acquire the portable treasure needed to fuel this gift-giving economy and enhance one's prestige. Social pressures also played a crucial role. The common practice of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited the family land, created a class of landless younger sons. Simply put, they had enough wealth and influence to fund a ship and get some tough men together. Some scholars also point to a demographic imbalance, a surplus of young men competing for the best marriage opportunities. While these internal pressures provided the motivation, the situation in Europe provided the opportunity. To the Norsemen, the kingdoms of the British Isles and the vast Carolingian Empire were treasure chests left unlocked. Monasteries, in particular, were seen not as holy sanctuaries, but as undefended repositories of wealth. Filled with gold and silver liturgical objects, they were easy targets for pagan raiders who felt no religious prohibition against plundering them. Beyond the monasteries, the political situation in Europe was increasingly fragile. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were often in a state of internal disarray, warring amongst themselves. More significantly, the mighty Carolingian Empire, which had once presented a formidable, well-defended frontier, began to weaken after the death of Charlemagne. His successors engaged in bitter conflicts over the division of the empire, which led to the neglect of coastal defenses. Vikings, with their peerless maritime technology and warrior culture, were perfectly positioned to exploit this vulnerability. Rather than engaging in high-risk, low-reward trading ventures, they could engage in low-risk, high-reward strikes on undefended monasteries. While the raid on Lindisfarne remains a pivotal event, the modern scholarly consensus has moved beyond viewing it as the singular, definitive start of the Viking Age. The historical and archaeological records paint a much more nuanced picture of a gradual escalation. The Viking Age didn't begin on a single Tuesday in June as was once thought. It emerged from a decades-long process that saw peaceful trade evolve into opportunistic piracy, and small-scale violence grow into ever larger raids. Perhaps the very question of when the age quote-unquote began is a product of our modern desire for neat historical periods. For the people living through it, there was no clear starting line. If a Norseman was chopping you to bits to get a silver chalice, you were living in the Viking Age.